we may hear with joy what you have to say to us today. Today's scripture reading is Psalm 4 that I'm going to read to you. Please follow. Answer me when I call, O God of my right. You gave me room when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. How long, you people, shall my honor suffer shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the faithful for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. When you are disturbed, do not sin. Ponder it in your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, "Oh, that we might see some good. Let the light of your face shine on us, O Lord. You have put gladness in my heart, more than when their grain and wine abound. I will both lie down and sleep in peace. For you alone, O Lord, make me lie down in safety." Amen.
Before I read the passage from Act 9 today, I just want to acknowledge that the location of today's reading is Damascus, Syria. And the appearance of this particular text in the narrative lectionary has seemed oddly prescient this week. Syria's been in the news often in the last days and weeks and months and years, and the news is never good. On Friday night, when the airstrike was launched by the U.S., France, and England in retaliation for Syrian President Assad's most recent attack against his own people with chemical weapons, one of the targets was the Barza Research and Development Center, which is just northeast of central Damascus. So as we hear these words and reflect on them, these words from Luke from so long ago, may we hold in prayer the people of Syria, whose lives continue to be impacted by violence and hatred 2,000 years later, and who are once again in the crosshairs. Luke writes in Acts 9, "Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' He asked, 'Who are you, Lord?' The reply came, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.' The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, 'Ananias.' He answered, 'Here I am, Lord.' The Lord said to him, 'Get up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. At this moment he is praying, and he has seen in a vision, a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight.' But Ananias answered, 'Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who invoke your name.' But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. I myself will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias went and entered the house. He laid his hands on Saul and said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was restored. Then he got up and was baptized. And after taking some food, he regained his strength. For several days he was with the disciples in Damascus, and immediately he began to proclaim Jesus in the synagogue, saying, "He is the Son of God." As a young teenager growing up in Chicago, Christian Picciolini was, in his words, lonely and lost. The brokenness of his own spirit and the brokenness of the family system he was growing up in made him especially vulnerable, and he was easily recruited by a white nationalist group. By the age of 16, he had emerged as a leader of the Chicago area skinheads. He helped recruit others to the movement. He was, in his own words, again, violent and powerful, and appeared to have a future in the world of organized hate. His first child was born when Picciolini was 22. He describes the event as transformative, an awakening that made him see himself and the world differently. And that is when he renounced his ties to the neo-Nazi movement. He co-founded a group called Life After Hate and has written extensively about that experience as a skinhead. He is a gentle and soft-spoken man who has become an articulate peacemaker. He runs a nonprofit that works for peace and has committed his life to helping others escape from that life that he once chose. The story of Saul's call and conversion is similarly dramatic and extreme. It's also one of the most familiar in the Bible. In fact, Saul's transformative experience is so well known that a road to Damascus moment is a part of the common lexicon. Even people who don't profess the same faith we do know that term describes a sudden and profound turning point in one's life. Saul first appears in Acts 7 when Stephen, a faithful follower of Jesus, is stoned to death after delivering a somewhat provocative sermon. After the murder, the young men who killed him laid their cloaks at Saul's feet in what seems to be an act of deference and respect toward their leader. In chapter 8, we learn that Saul approved the stoning, and as the persecution of Jesus' followers increases, Saul becomes an enthusiastic participant, literally dragging men and women from their homes into prison. Here in chapter 9, we learn a lot more about who Saul is and why he is the way he is. Saul is a self-proclaimed enemy of Christ's church and tormentor of all who follow Jesus because he rejects their claim that Jesus is the Messiah. As a staunchly conservative Jew, Saul doesn't believe that Jesus, who was killed on the cross, has been raised from the dead, and he is deeply offended by the Jews who profess something that he vehemently denies. But Saul's one of those guys who can't simply agree to disagree. He is enraged by what feels like a threat, not only to him personally, but to the faith tradition on which he has staked his life, and to national security. He resents the Jesus followers and their message of love and peace and new life. He wants to stop them from getting any more folks all riled up. He believes he's doing God's work, as he is breathing threats and murder. On this particular day, Saul is on the road to Damascus, and with the blessing of the high priest, looking to round up even more Jesus-worshiping Jews and take them to Jerusalem to be tortured or perhaps killed. But this flash of light from heaven sends him to his knees and renders him blind. Then the disembodied voice of Jesus calls him by name and calls him out for his thuggish behavior, scaring the living daylights out of Saul's companions. And although they're terrified, they follow the voice's directions and take the now dependent and helpless Saul into the city. And in that moment, the hate-spewing, violent, religious guy becomes a silent and defenseless man. By the end of the passage, after 3 days of hunger and darkness, Saul is ministered to by Ananias, one of the Jesus-worshiping Jews whom he had previously been intent on killing. In the grace-filled encounter between them, Ananias' touch restores Saul's sight, and soon he is baptized in Christ's name, touched by God's Spirit, and chosen to be a witness to the risen Christ he encountered on the road to Damascus. His transformation is remarkable and seemingly complete. From radical defender of the most fundamentalist form of Judaism, driven to destroy those who strayed from what he believed, to one of the most influential followers of Jesus ever. Saul, whom we now know as Paul, became a model of discipleship, a passionate leader in the fledgling movement. Conversion may not be the best word to describe what he experienced because he remained a Jew, but he was zealously committed to sharing the gospel with Gentiles, as zealously committed to that as he had once been to trying to squash them. Scholars observe that Paul, spent the rest of his life establishing and nurturing churches and not so much trying to save individual souls. And his reach was long. He traveled some 10,000 miles over the rest of his life to share the good news. And when he couldn't get to churches because he was in prison or because he was physically disabled and couldn't do that, he wrote letters to the new faith communities. Nearly a quarter of the New Testament is attributed to Paul. And in what is kind of an ironic turn of events, he was persecuted and eventually martyred in the name of Jesus. Compelling as it is, Saul's isn't the only transformation in the story. Ananias is already a disciple, and an obedient one at that, when Jesus appears to him in a vision and tells him to go to Saul and lay hands on him. His response sounds something like, "You're joking," right? Saul's reputation is widely known, as he reminds the risen Lord, and he isn't interested in becoming Saul's next victim. With good reason, he is afraid. But it's more than that. Jesus is asking Ananias to demonstrate compassion to a man who has threatened his people, persecuted and killed his friends and neighbors, made life a living hell for the church in Damascus, and who could snap him in half like a twig if he wanted to. And so Ananias is faced with this really difficult decision: obey the Lord's command and love his enemy, or refuse and hope for the best. The reality is that Ananias is astounded that the Lord would make such a request of him, and that God would choose someone as despicable, as evil as Saul, as a representative of the gospel. God has really bad taste sometimes. It makes no sense to Ananias. But when the Lord tells him, "Go, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen," he does. And as quickly as Saul went from menacing to meek, Ananias moves from resistant to resolve. He speaks to Saul with kindness, calling him Brother Saul, lays hands upon him, and receives him into the fellowship of the church. And in doing so, Ananias makes possible the completion of the healing that Jesus has begun in Saul. And we know that because the text says immediately something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he began to see differently. But the truth is both of them do. Both Saul and Ananias begin to see each other and themselves more clearly. The scales aren't just in Saul's eyes. Whatever blinded each of them to the other's humanity, fear, ignorance, prejudice, stereotypes, resentment, preconceived notions about the other and his beliefs, disappear in that moment of connection. And both of them are changed by the encounter. But the transformation isn't just for their own personal benefit. As is typical for God, the change is for the greater good. God uses both of them to spread the good news of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Without Ananias' courage and obedience, Saul's transformation might not have occurred, and without Saul's healing, there might not be a Bible or a church as we know them today. God called both men to do hard. Saul to relinquish power and control, to turn his back on a faith system that had empowered and rewarded him, and to accept a truth that he had once rejected. And Ananias to love his enemy, to literally touch a man who had wanted to kill him, to imagine the murderous Saul as an instrument of God's love. So, I've known you for a little while. My guess is that most of you have a hard time identifying with Saul in the passage. I mean, all of us can be difficult and cranky, opinionated and defensive, but most of us don't become killers for an ideology. But Ananias, he's a different story. More likely, I think, that we've all resisted God's call to love an enemy now and then, refused to forgive someone who has hurt us, failed to acknowledge God's work in the heart of one with whom we radically disagree, walked away from opportunities to show compassion and healing to folks we deem evil, despicable, unlikable, or different. In our transformations, not everyone can be Paul, but we all can and should be Ananias. Receptive to God's call and open to being used by God to heal deep divisions and create community and transform enemies into friends. In fact, if the church and we individually as Christians cannot be and do like Ananias, we are rejecting God's very call on our lives. The church ought to be the place where we learn to see differently, ourselves, each other, and God. This is the place, right, where others ought to be invested in our transformation, where our prejudices are erased, where our stereotypes are rejected, where enemies are reconciled, where we are empowered to make hard decisions and choices, and where we willingly undergo conversions, uncomfortable, sometimes unwanted conversions, for the sake of the gospel. Calls and conversions come from God, but we can either accept them or turn from them. Kathleen Norris, in her book Amazing Grace, writes this about conversion, and it speaks to me. Not sure about you. There is a powerful moment, she says, in any religious conversion in which a person realizes that all of the mentors and all they have said, all of the time spent in reading scripture or engaged in what felt like stupid, boring, or plain hopeless prayer, has been of help after all. It is nothing you have done, but all of it is one event, God's being there and being of help. The enemies you were facing, whatever obstacles seemed amassed against you, even in your own confusion, have simply vanished. And you are certain that it is God who has brought you to this moment, which may even feel like victory. So may God give to each of us the grace to receive the victory that God wants for us, the vision